Please be seated. The function today has been planned to critical military timing, unlike World War II. I extend a warm welcome to our guest, the Honourable Mr Adrian Pedrick, Member for Hammond, the Mayor of the rural city of Murray Bridge, Mr Brenton Lewis, the Mayor of the the Mayor of the Coorong District Council, Mr Neville Yench. They will be assisting us with the presentations later on today. I wish to also thank the Army and Air Force cadets under Di Bolton and Alan Burt for their part in today's event. These young people are the Defence Force personnel of tomorrow. I also wish to thank Pipe Major Bob Baldwin for his support in piping on the colours. Whilst I'm thanking people, I'd like to thank my colleagues from the Murray Bridge RSL who have all worked so very hard to make today happen. There's been so much happened behind the scenes, and when people refer to that little duck swimming on the mill pond, looking all calm and serene, but under the surface paddling like bloody hell, that's what my colleagues have done. These people have made the difference between a mediocre event to an event worthy of surviving World War II veterans. To my colleagues, I thank you very much. In particular, I welcome the ladies and gentlemen you see seated in the front row who have come here with their families today to hear just a little bit about how we value their part in our lives. Later on we'll hear from the Honourable Adrian Pedrick and the Mayor of the rural city of Murray Bridge, Mr Brenton Lewis, about the importance of this day in our lives. And their words will be followed by some presentations to our living heroes. At a later date, further presentations will be made by Mayor Lewis and the RSL committee to some World War II veterans who are confined in nursing homes. There are, of course, sadly, some who wish no part in any sort of remembrance of the war, and we acknowledge their wishes. We also honour these brave people today. Today, I remember the 6 years my own father fought during the Second World War, and the 6 years my mother spent at home waiting for him. Today, I'll remember their sacrifices along with yours. Since the inception of this idea to commemorate the 70th anniversary of VP Day, I have been inundated with phone calls of people who wanted to attend today's service. I have received calls from legacy widows and friends of our heroes, and just ordinary people who all wanted to say thank you. Our focus today is on the brave men and women who stood up to be counted when it mattered. Our focus today is to reinforce the way we live so that those who come tomorrow will enjoy this same freedom. Suffice to say, Murray Bridge, South Australia and Australia say thank you. What happened in the Murray Valley during World War I? Correction, World War II. I'm going too far back. Some of these people seated in the front row wouldn't know because they weren't here. They were defending our country in other countries. In 1939, World War II began. Many men left the Murray Valley to join the armed forces, and it is estimated up to 70,000 along the Murray River from Goolwa to Mildura signed up. Much of their previous work was taken over by the women they left behind. Food production and processing in the Murray Valley is very important to the war effort. Training camps and prison camps are established at various locations in the valley, at Lake Boga, Loveday and Murray Bridge, just to name a few. Paddle steamers are brought out of retirement briefly to collect firewood to supply Melbourne. Italian prisoners of war crew those boats. In 1940, the Murray Mouth barrages were completed. Water quality in the lower lake and lakes is improved by the prevention of seawater ingress during lower river flow. How we've come backwards there, eh? Stable water level is maintained on the lakes of the lower Murray. However, in 1944 to 45, we experienced a severe drought. The value of irrigation agriculture was reinforced by drought and World War II. In 1945, the Morgan Whyalla pipeline was completed. The pipeline from Morgan was to take water to the BHP Irons Foundry and the shipyard at Whyalla, which were regarded as vital to the war effort. Maybe we could say something about the Australian Submarine Corporation in that vein, but we won't. 15th of August 1945, 70 years ago today, the war in the Pacific came to an end. We come to the military part of the service now. Ladies and gentlemen, I once again ask those of you who could, please stand for the last post and reciting of the ode by RSL Mammon President, Mr. John Doughty. Uniform members are asked to salute.
Oh, love you.
Shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them. Lest we forget. Lest we forget.
Thank you, John. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please be seated. I'll ask you now to please welcome the Honourable Adrian Pedrick.
I do have to lift that up a fraction. Look, thank you very much, David, and look, I'd like to thank David and everyone from the RSL for the work they've done in getting this day together. Acknowledge the mayors, local mayors, Brent Lewis and Neville Yench, returned servicemen and women, family and friends. Great to see and hear everyone today, and for the commemoration of the end of the war. Victory in the Pacific Day is a very important occasion for all Australians. It holds special significance for the generation who endured the Second World War, particularly our South Australian veterans, and for those whose loved ones never returned. It signifies the end of a time in our recent history when Australia was vulnerable to Japanese invasion, when freedom as we know it was very seriously threatened. Today, as we reflect on the service and sacrifice of our veterans, let us take a moment to consider what it was that they fought for 70 years ago. The early years of World War II in Europe and the Middle East brought very little change to daily life for most South Australian families. As in the First World War, South Australians felt comfortably dislocated, both emotionally and geographically, from the distant fronts. With the majority of our trained Australian forces already heavily committed in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, Prime Minister John Curtin necessarily withdrew most of them to meet critical defence of Australian requirements. In January 1942, Japan captured Rabaul, the capital of the Australian-controlled territory of New Guinea, and within weeks, Australian and Dutch forces had surrendered the island of Ambon in the Netherlands East Indies. The Japanese rapidly overpowered Allied forces in Malaya, and 15,000 men of Australia's 8th Division were taken captive when Singapore fell on the 15th of February 1942. The loss of Singapore meant the Malay barrier had been breached, and Australia was in potential danger and under serious threat. War arrived in Australia on the 19th of February 1942 with a devastating air raid on Darwin, and during the next 6 months, Northern Australia, from Broome to Townsville, suffered almost 100 Japanese air raids. Plans to abandon most of the Australian continent north of the famous Brisbane line, between the cities of Adelaide and Brisbane, illustrates the seriousness with which Australia contemplated possible Japanese invasion. Plans were made for Private Bob Channon and his fellow soldiers from the 10th Battalion, based in Murray Bridge, to blow up the bridges over the River Murray should the Japanese cross that Brisbane line. Thankfully, it never came to that. Indeed, some of you probably still remember the air raid shelters built in your backyards and schools. It was a fact of life. The war was on our doorstep. With this radical lifestyle shift for most Australians came a strong sense of community, of being all in together. Contributions to the war effort, including the employment of women in typically male trades and professions, including armament and munitions factories. Our farmers and graziers were magnificent in sustaining South Australia's essential primary industry throughout the war years, ably supported by the Women's Land Army. But the focus of Australia's effort in the war was on the men and women serving abroad. Almost 1 million Australian men and women enlisted during the Second World War, the largest commitment of Australian soldiers, sailors and airmen in our history. However, despite strong enlistment numbers, there were manpower shortages in all three services as Australia became more heavily involved in the war against Japan in the Pacific. The Army's manning problems were compounded by a lack of modern equipment, limited pre-war preparation and little appropriate training for tropical jungle conditions. The Air Force too was undermanned and under-equipped. However, newly formed Australian squadrons finally joined the Pacific Campaign to meet urgency needed air reconnaissance, strike, close air support and resupply requirements. During these early years of the war, some 22,000 Australian sailors, soldiers, airmen, nurses and civilians were interned in Japanese prisoner of war camps. Although it is difficult for us to understand what these brave Australians endured, the fact that 1/3 of our POWs perished in captivity is some indication of the appalling conditions they suffered. Almost half of the 15,000 Australian servicemen captured at Singapore later perished as prisoners of war at Changi and on the Burma Railway. We remember the mighty deeds of Weary Dunlop and his magnificent doctors and medical staff. Japan's invasion of Timor in February 1942 at first seemed to be another easy victory. However, in a display of characteristic resilience, Australian forces soon organised an effective guerrilla campaign in which the independent companies distinguished themselves. Australian ships faced a precarious passage in support of the Timor guerrilla campaign. One Japanese airstrike took HMAS Armidale and the lives of 100 Australian sailors. The first major strategic victories in the Pacific came only after the Allies had endured several months of heavy losses to Japanese air, sea and land forces. In the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, a United States-Australian Joint Task Force, including 3 Australian cruisers, Australia, Canberra and Hobart, stalled the Japanese southward advance, and in June 1942, the Japanese achieved a critical maritime victory at the Battle of Midway, in which the Japanese lost their very important aircraft carriers. Strategic defeat at Midway eliminated Japan's strategic amphibious capability, and her plans to advance on Port Moresby were thus limited to a landward approach via Milne Bay and the Kokoda Track. Despite being overwhelmingly outnumbered, under-resourced and poorly trained initially, Australian soldiers, including the Militia 39th Battalion, famously resisted the Japanese advance on the Kokoda Track, whilst our troops and Air Force at Milne Bay inflicted the first defeat of the Japanese in the war. British Field Marshal Sir William Slim, the commander of the 14th Army in Burma, later commented that, and I quote, "Australian troops had, at Milne Bay, inflicted on the Japanese their first undoubted defeat on land. Some of us may forget that, of all the Allies, it was the Australians who first broke the invincibility of the Japanese army." And I think that's something that we should be proud of and we should remember for all time. In the months that followed, Australian ships and aircraft played key roles in transporting troops and supplies and providing escorts and fire support during the bitter and hard-fought New Guinea campaign. On the last day of May 1942, 3 Japanese midget submarines attacked Sydney Harbour, followed by several minor attacks on Australia's southern coastline by conventional Japanese submarines, which included the shelling of Newcastle. In the following months, Japanese submarines sank 6 Allied merchant ships off the east coast of Australia. Several more merchant ships were hit in 1943, and in May that year, 268 perished when the Australian hospital ship Centaur was sunk in Queensland waters. After the defeat of the Japanese at Kokoda and Milne Bay, Australian and American units between November 1942 and January 1943 fought the Japanese in northern Papua, Buna, Gona, Sanananda, Finzhafen and Wewak in a series of costly battles where no quarter was shown or expected. By early 1943, Allied forces had halted Japanese offences in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. General MacArthur's island hopping strategy saw a ball recaptured, triggering a steady northward advance. In 1945, Australian land, air and sea forces launched coordinated assaults against the Japanese at Tarakan, Labuan and Balikpapan. These were the biggest, most complex and the final Australian campaigns of World War II. Preparations were then being made for what would have been an extraordinarily costly assault on Japan itself. However, with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the Emperor saw the futility of continuing the war and was persuaded to surrender unconditionally on the 15th of August. In Australia, Victory in the Pacific Day ended 6 years of hardship, sacrifice and anguish, and signalled the start of a new era of peace. However, the war did take an enormous toll on the physical and emotional health of our veterans, and many never fully recovered. Broken marriages, alcoholism and depression were just some of the symptoms for many of the wartime generation, and I must admit it still happens with our new veterans as they come back from our activities where servicemen and women have to serve overseas. Aboriginal Australians were not immune to the effects of the war. Indeed, many Indigenous Australians enlisted and served alongside their non-Indigenous mates. Great demand for Indigenous labour, particularly in Northern Australia, helped to break down prejudices and gave hope to many Aboriginal Australians for a more equitable post-war community. So what should we remember on Victory in the Pacific Day 2015? We remember almost 1 million Australian men and women who served and the 40,000 who died fighting to protect the freedom we enjoy today. We remember that they fought to protect the Australian way of life, our democracy, our culture and our land. We remember and cherish the spirit of their service before self, their sense of humour and fair play, of individual and group responsibility, and their firm belief that true democratic freedom must be nurtured and protected, and when threatened is worth fighting and, if necessary, dying for. We appreciate that through their valour, our country emerged from the Second World War with a new sense of economic, political and social independence. Although still very much a part of the British Commonwealth, Australia had forged a close and enduring relationship with the United States throughout the Pacific Campaign. Japan's post-war democratisation led to stronger economic ties with Australia, and today Japan rates among our closest trading and dialogue partners. So on this 70th anniversary of Victory in the Pacific, how best do we express our gratitude to our veterans of the various campaigns? I think it is to seize the marvellous opportunities that we have been given to become a nation of excellence, the global example in everything we undertake. We have the people, the institutions, the physical and moral courage, the tolerance and the innovative capacity to be the best in every field of endeavour, and in so being to permanently ensure our future long-term prosperity and security both regionally and globally. To those who served and the many thousands who made the supreme sacrifice 70 years ago, the nation extends its deepest and most sincere gratitude. On behalf of all Australians, and especially South Australians, I salute you and I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Your words are significant to not only those who have worn the uniforms of this nation, but to those who stood and waited for their loved ones to return. I'm humbled today to stand in front of the ladies and gentlemen in the front row. I lost my own father 20 years ago, and as I said before, he served, and I was humbled in his presence, and I think you people have just taken his place. I thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mayor Brenton Lewis.
Thank you, David. VP Day. Distinguished guests, World War II heroes that are present today, ladies and gentlemen. As has been said, there are some people that aren't here today. We understand some people aren't well enough to be here today, and David did indicate that at a later date when it's suitable, we'll be visiting where they are. In some cases it's places like Lurwen, to extend to them again our thanks for what it is they've done for our country. So 70 years ago today, the Second World War in the Pacific came to an end. This day, the 15th of August, was to become known as BP Day, or BJ Day, the victory over Japan, the BJ. The Prime Minister of Australia at the time was Ben Chifley, and he announced the momentous occasion with these words: "Fellow citizens, the war is over." They must have been fantastic for people to have heard those words actually uttered at that time. And I think that in listening to Adrian, we realised how close we came to being brutalised. Those of us that were not at the front, already possibly being brutalised, but those that were at home, how close did we come? And we should never forget that. The Japanese government had accepted the terms of the surrender imposed by the Allied nations, and hostilities were now to cease. The reply by the Japanese government to the note sent by Britain and the United States, the USSR and China has been received and accepted by the Allied nations. At this moment, let us all offer thanks to God. Let us remember those whose lives were given that we may enjoy the glorious moment and may look forward to the peace which they have won for us. By the beginning of 1945, the Australians had been at war for over 5 years, 1945. Now they believed that the Allies would be victorious and that the war in Europe and the war in Japan would come to an end. In Europe, the Germans surrendered on the 7th of May, just a week after the death of Adolf Hitler. The Australian prisoners of war in European prison camps were liberated. The Australian sailors, the air crew, began returning home. 3 months later, devastated by the Allied bombing and the threat of invasion, Japan surrendered on the 6th and 9th of August. On the 6th and the 9th of August, the American bombers had dropped the atomic bombs that we're all well aware of on the two Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese ceased fighting a week later on August the 15th, hence the date that we are entrenching and remembering. August the 15th, 1945. And on the 2nd of September in that year, 1945, they formally surrendered to the Allies in a ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in Thankyou Bay. Other surrenders of Japanese armies in the field took place across Asia and the Pacific region. Thousands of servicemen and women now began returning home, and the surviving prisoners of war were released and repatriated. As Adrian's already pointed out, almost 1 million Australians served in World War II, and about 40,000 of them had died. Many thousands were wounded or injured in the course of their military service. Myself personally, my father fought in the Pacific, particularly New Guinea. My dad died at 54, and the diagnosis was that probably a fair bit of it was related to wartime stress and injury. So, you know, we all have our ways of being touched by what people have done for us to stand here proud today and free. With the war's end, hundreds of thousands of servicemen and women had to adjust their lives as civilians. The women who played such a vital role during wartime were now expected to return to their homes and become more like mothers again. So, you know, that's a fair old act, you know, the white slippers under the white sink and so on, but the ladies played their part in the war and then returned home and become the mothers of a lot of us that are here today. For many Australians, the years ahead would be challenging, as Adrian's also pointed out, and this was very much the case in the rural areas, including our Murray lands. The women who had tended the farms and worked in the dairies and toiled in the factories were now going back to being the housewives, mothers and shopkeepers, and etc. And they looked after their men as they returned home. Not every woman was so lucky, with many only finding out of the fate of their loved ones at the cessation of the war, not knowing what had happened through the war. Many thousands of Allied soldiers, sailors and airmen had been captured and ended their war as prisoners of war in the hellish POW camps throughout most of Southeast Asia, where they were treated with less dignity than they deserved. Thousands died in these labour camps, and many more died shortly after repatriation. We remember those brave fallen souls every Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, and on this time, on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II in the Pacific, we remember them again. On this day, we also thank you to our last surviving heroes, the men and women in front of me. We thank you for putting your lives on the line so that we may live in the peace that we live in today. I can't say that any more than what I said. We're so thankful to all of you. On this day, we thank you for giving up so many years of your lives to ensure that our nation remains the nation that we are, truly a lucky nation. I hope that we continue to be a lucky nation by respecting what you've done for us and taking from that we need to take care of ourselves. You did what you could do, it's up to us now to take care of ourselves in the future. You've given us that opportunity. On this day and on August the 15th every year for eternity, we thank you and your comrades who paid the supreme sacrifice for giving us the freedom that we would not have enjoyed had you not stood in harm's way. On this day I say thank you, and I'm sure that everyone here today says thank you. We all say thank you. I wish to, in closing, just acknowledge David Craig for his passion and commitment to the services in general. For us to be in this wonderful facility today, it's the efforts and work of people like David and his committee, fellow committee, that have given us that opportunity. I'd also like to come clean and say that David's had a fair bit to do with constructing the detail for the speeches today, and he should be thanked for that as well. Thanks, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenton. I know we all join in reinforcing your strong words, and by saying thank you, we can't thank you enough. Shortly, I'll ask the two regional mayors to come forward to make presentations to their constituents, and I would ask our veterans to please come forward to receive your presentation when your name is called, or we can bring it to you. You are to receive a Shield of Honour and a Certificate of Gratitude signed by Brigadier Tim Hanna, AM, RSL State President, South Australia and New South Wales. He sends the following words. He can't be here today because he's down at the VP Day ceremony in Adelaide. This Saturday marks 70 years since then Prime Minister Ben Chifley declared that the Second World War was officially over, with the Japanese government accepting the Allied nations' terms of surrender. Across the country, events will be held today to reflect the celebrations that took place following Prime Minister Chifley's 1945 declaration. Here today, we are very fortunate to have Second World War veterans and their families from the local Murray Bridge district and surrounds who have gathered to commemorate, to reflect, to grieve and to remember the service of all Australians during its darkest period. Nearly 1 million Australians served in the Second World War, and around 30,000 were captured as prisoners of war, and about 40,000 would make the ultimate sacrifice and never come home. On the 6th of August 1945, an offensive by United States B-29 bombers began dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities, the first on Hiroshima and the second 3 days later on Nagasaki. The offensive destroyed both cities with more than 200,000 people killed. A little after noon, in Japan Standard Time, on the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced to Japan their acceptance of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration and was broadcast to the Japanese people over the radio. In Australia, the announcement was met first with disbelief and then with a spontaneous outpouring of happiness never before or seen since in Australia. The main streets of almost every city and town across the nation became rallying points. Australians not normally given to public displays of emotion danced in the streets through piles of shredded paper which rained down from office buildings. Motor traffic came to a halt and trams inched along main streets with revelers clinging to the sides and the roofs. Prime Minister Ben Shipley declared the 15th and the 16th of August public holidays. The uninhibited rejoicing of the 15th gave way to more formalised celebrations on the 16th as victory marches were staged through most major cities. Turnouts of citizens to watch these displays were similar to those which had farewelled AIF divisions departing for the Middle East in 1940. That day of Ben Shipley's announcement became known as VP Day. The formal surrender of the Japanese Empire took place on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September of that year. I cannot imagine how it must have felt to hear, after 6 long years, that the war had finally ended. I cannot imagine what it must have been like to be on the front line fighting the Axis forces in Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I cannot imagine what it must have been like to have suffered so terribly as a prisoner of war. I cannot imagine what it must have been like to be the family of a soldier, sailor or airman who did not return home. We are grateful that so many of you have successfully forgiven your captors and have made such a wonderful contribution to Australian society in so many fields since 1945. During the centenary of Anzac period, we acknowledge the service and sacrifice of all Australians who have served in all wars, conflicts and peacekeeping operations over a century of service. The acknowledgement of the 70th anniversary of the Second World War is an important component of our commemorative agenda. I hope you enjoyed the day. For some it will bring back bad memories, but you are amongst friends and family. If you ever doubted it, then you should know today that you are very much appreciated. We are proud of what you did for us all. Tim Hanna, AM, RSL State President. I will convey to him that he received a resounding applause, standing ovation, and a ticker tape parade. Now comes the nice part of the service today, when we get to honour our veterans materially. If I can get my papers together here. Firstly, I'd like to ask Mayor Neville Yench just to come over to the presentation table assisted by Mr Bob Perkins, if you wouldn't mind. Mayor Dave Burgess was supposed to come today and make some presentations, but he's unable to make it, so Mayor Yench will make some presentations on his behalf. The first presentation is to Keith Lowe. Thank you, Keith. Mrs. Erica Tim. Mrs. Rhonda Frick. Mr. Peter Turner. Mincham.
Stay there, my friend. You would have done enough walking.
Mr. John Dillon. So John drove himself up from Meningie, or Troy Taylor and Benning today. He's not joined by his family because most of his family are still serving members of the Australian Defence Force. I think that's it from the Murray lands. Thank you, Neville. Brendan? We'll start first with Mrs. Pam Harris.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next comes Mr. Snow Harris, second as usual.
Oh, heavens no.
Mr. Eric Mail. Mr. Robert Steele. I had a phone call from a lady, I think 10, 12 days ago, and she said, is it too late to get my dad in? And I thought, who am I to say no? So the next presentation is to Mr. Alan Wood. Mr. Bob Channon. have that many photos for today. If anybody wishes photos later on, we have our official photographer here, Deanna, who's going to take photos of some of our veterans down the back, and she will send photos to us at the RSL here, so if anybody wishes photos of the event today, contact us here at the RSL and we'll email them through. In the event of our veterans, we'll send them by pigeon post, I think. Mr. Gordon Jenke. And Mr. George Heath. I must say that George is a bit of a ring-in because he didn't complete the entire war. On the 29th of June 1944, his Halifax bomber was shot down over Europe, and he spent the majority of the rest of the war evading the Axis forces. We had a phone call the other day, George, from the Department of Defence, and they said you signed for the plane and they'd like it back. Okay, I'll tell them that. Right, now the logistics of today's event have been horrific on our part. I would hate for any veterans, World War II veterans, to be here today without receiving acknowledgement. As it was when you were in the forces, is there any man or woman who hasn't had their name called? So you're all on the roll. Thank you very much. We have a presentation now to take place, after which we'll get Bob Channon to officially open the museum, assisted by Adrian Pedrick, corrections by Brenton Lewis. Adrian's going to assist with a presentation right now. In 1945, after guarding the bridges over the River Murray, and then being sent off to fight the war in New Guinea and the Dutch Hebrides, Bob Channon returned home to Australia and recounted the following story to me many years later. Bob told me he'd served faithfully without being seriously wounded or captured, and considered himself very lucky to return home. On arrival back in Australia, all Bob and his mates wanted to do was have a few drinks and get drunk. They visited a few pubs, but every pub was out of beer and spirits thanks to the Yanks. So the only thing they could find to drink was some bubbly pink stuff, which was all that was left, and that was duly drank. The result was that they all got fairly stomped and decided that rather than go back to the barracks in that state, they would sleep it off in the local park. Bob took off his shoes, put his wallet and a watch his parents had given him for his 21st birthday in the shoes and went to sleep on the grass. Next morning he woke up and the lot were gone. It's a shame that he had to go through the war and then come back to Australia to be stripped of some of his belongings. However, most of you who are wearing your full-size medals will have noticed today that Bob has come to this event in a state of ceremonial undress by wearing only his miniature medals in place of his full-size medals, which are encased in a frame for perpetuity. Years ago, Bob, you were guilty of losing Commonwealth equipment. We can't replace that equipment, but we would like to present you with a full set of medals, which you hope you will wear for many years to come. he's properly dressed. I might say just before we proceed to opening the museum and partaking in afternoon tea, I'd like to thank you for everybody who supported the event today. And to our veterans, you can see how much we value your service, and I thank you for hanging around for 70 years so that we could honour you. That little vision of the duck just paddling on top of the water, but underneath going like bloody hell, that's what it's been all the way through. But once we declare the museum open, I'd ask you to please go through, have a look around. The RSL committee here, under Bob Perkins, who's our museum curator, have worked extremely hard to bring some of our exhibits up to date. And in the last few weeks, I think we've just about doubled the size of our items in the museum, just from donations from people who say, well, you know, we don't need this in our home anymore, or I found this in the shed, some of it's live. Other stuff was procured from the Defence Forces, and the Defence Forces don't know about it, so probably the best place is in our museum. Bob Shannon was a former president of our RSL here. His name is up on the honour board. He also was a competitive bowler for the RSL Bowling Club. When it came to putting a name on our museum, I don't think there were too many names that were bandied around, and I think 4 or 5 people suggested Bob's name. I did ask Bob's permission a few weeks ago, and he said he would be humbled and very honoured for us to name the museum after him. So without further ado, I'd like Bob to come forward. I believe he'd like to say a few words, and then we'll get Brenton Lewis to assist Bob with opening the museum.
Thank you, David, for that. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to thank the RSL for honouring me in naming the Bob Shannon RSL Museum. Thank you very much to the committee and members of the RSL. And I'd especially like to thank David Lang, behind me here, who has done a lot of work in the preparation for this afternoon. And David, I know that all these people would appreciate what you've done, and I do too. Thank you very much. I have been an RSL member, for 70 years, having joined in Brisbane when on leave from New Guinea, and prior to leaving for Borneo in 1945, where I participated in the landing at Balikpapan. I've enjoyed my time with the RSL, having served on the committee for over 40 years, and it's been my second home for a very long time. These club rooms are on the 3rd site in Murray Bridge, and I know you're all appreciative of the new venue. Once again, my sincere thanks to David and the RSL committee for the honour. Thank you very much.
Bob's in such a hurry to open his museum, he doesn't want any photos taken. I'd like to ask Mr. Shannon to be the first to inspect the museum. And ladies and gentlemen, please feel free. Afternoon tea will be served in about 5 minutes, sandwiches. The bar will be open. I'm going to drink the first keg myself. And I invite you all to please patronise the bar and have a sandwich. Thank you once again, especially to our veterans for their service and for their attendance today. I'm glad we didn't leave anybody out, but we'll still make further presentations later on in the nursing homes. So on behalf of Merv Shop, the President, the Committee of Management and the members of the Murray Beach RSL Sub-Branch, I say thank you.
Really got out of the part of the memory. So I'll forget half of it. You know, talking to someone. Yeah.
Stick?
Somebody's good.
On the hour, you know, like when you would, the street military coming out and police last post. So I made those, I think, to the museum. That was.
I heard of that when they did that place. Yeah, that was it.
Well, that's the first night for me. That was the final.
Yeah, but
Hey, all.
when they
Young fella. Where's your where's the trophy thing?
What?
Where's your protector?
Under my feet.
Oh,
The land I was standing on.
yeah, that one. Here, got to hold. You just hold that up for a sec.
The kids do a lovely job.
Oh, beautiful. Have you enjoyed today? Yeah, enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah. Yeah, really good. Really good.
Stop filming.
You don't want me to film you?
No, it goes in one ear out the other.
Oh, rightio. No, you're all right. Not a problem.
Just up the top.
So say again. So with the sword, what would they do?
From tailbone to head, you're saying?
Cut him in half from the backside to the head in one swipe.
Really?
There he'd be lame.